Hello and welcome. I'm Fahd Husain. Tonight, Islamabad waits. And I use that word deliberately. Islamabad waits. It waits for two delegations that may yet arrive. It waits as the ceasefire clock ticks down towards a deadline that now feels less like a date on a calendar and more like a warning. And it waits knowing that what happens in the next hours may decide whether this region moves back towards diplomacy or slides again towards war. The US says it expects talk to proceed. A US delegation is preparing to come. Iran has signaled hesitation, even mistrust. There is uncertainty. There are last-minute complications. There are reasons for skepticism, and yet the channel is still open. Pakistan helped broker the ceasefire. Pakistan hosted the first 21 hours of talks. Pakistan has been working the phones, moving diplomatically, preparing security, preparing logistics, preparing the ground, preparing, in other words, for peace. Security has been tightened, arrangements are in place, Islamabad is ready. The question tonight is whether the parties are ready. None of the major players truly want this war to restart. Not Washington, not Tehran, not the Gulf. This may be one of those rare days when a great deal is decided in a very short span of time. So where do we stand tonight? Are we on the edge of a second chance or the edge of renewed conflict? These are tonight's questions, and they deserve a serious conversation. Let's have it. To discuss this, we are joined by Uzair Yunus. He is a partner at the Asia Group in the US, also a well-known policy analyst, keeps a very close eye on the politics and economy, not only of Pakistan, but of the whole region. Uzair Yunus, welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me, Fahd.
So now, obviously, this is a very important day. So much happening and yet not enough happening. We're not sure exactly where things are going. The ceasefire deadline is now inching closer by the hour. What is the sense of where you are? Is the whole scene very tense? Are people bracing for peace, or in fact the prospects of war starting again are dangerously near?
So I think at this point in time, Fahd, where we are is there definitely is a lot of confusion, even in Washington, D.C., about where things stand and what is the next step, or what are the outcomes from the next round of talks between the United States and Iran. My own assessment at this point is that there's a lot of pomp and circumstance of diplomacy that is being played out in an always online world. And what do I mean by that? For example, when the first round of talks happened, you will recall, and your audience will recall, that the Iranians were in Islamabad first, and they had to wait for the Americans to arrive and then begin the conversation. I think this time around, what we will likely see is the Americans will come in first, and the Iranians will come in second, to sort of have this balance, right, of who plays the waiting game and who gets to sort of enter the room at the end, which is the pomp and circumstance part. And in addition to that, you have the tweets, you have the statements, you have, people making off-record comments, etc., about what's going on. What I think is likely to happen, and the base case scenario, in my opinion, is that we are further ahead in terms of the framework than people think. I do not think that General Munir, or Field Marshal Munir, would have gone to Tehran for a number of days to talk to the IRGC and other Iranians, only to have the talks be derailed at the last minute. So I'm positively hopeful that whenever the talks resume in Islamabad, we will see an extension of a ceasefire, as well as a broad momentum being built towards a framework agreement between the United States and Iran.
I would actually tend to agree with you, because I think you're absolutely right. There was a lot of work done after the first round, and you mentioned the visit of Field Marshal Asim Munir to Tehran. I think that was a crucial moment, and the very fact that President Trump then announced that he is going to send his team to Islamabad, to me at least, that meant that Pakistan had communicated the discussion in Tehran, and there was clearly enough grounds for President Trump to say, okay, let's give it another shot.
I agree. And I think, again, part of that agreement and the framework that has been reached as well, right, is not only that the trip to Tehran was important, but what people forgot when the first round ended and there were a lot of reports about this being a failure, what people did not appreciate is that unlike the Americans, the Iranian delegation cannot be in real-time communication with their leadership, especially the supreme leader. They are following a mosaic doctrine of like decentralized communications, which is obviously the rational choice to make given the assassination campaigns. And so they had to go back and they had to engage internally, right? So my view is that we're halfway along or more than halfway along in this agreement. And the other important signal to me has been that the Lebanon-Israel conversation is also moving forward in parallel. So if the talks were not proceeding positively, then that channel most definitely would have collapsed by now. And then, of course, we would have been talking about an imminent collapse of the ceasefire in the Strait of Hormuz as well.
It seems very clearly that there's a public narrative which is going along, and then there's a private back channel conversation which may not be as hawkish as what we are hearing publicly. And I say that in the context of the various posts and tweets that President Trump has been doing in the last couple of days, which have been very aggressive, very inflammatory, very provocative, and they've had a reaction from the Iranian side also. There's this incident of the ship, Americans taking over an Iranian ship, etc., etc. So there's a lot of things happening which seem to suggest that if there's any deal in the offing, it doesn't seem very promising. But at the same time, clearly there is a back channel also going on. So the way that President Trump has been communicating, do you think that's all for public consumption, and behind all of this there is a very rational and calculated back channel going on?
Well, part of it is obviously his own personality and his own style of negotiation, right? If you recall, the first Trump administration used to refer to the North Korean leadership as Rocket Man, right? And like really inflammatory stuff that people were worried about. And then we ended up having a summit all of a sudden, right? So that's his approach, for good and for bad, in my opinion. And the madman theory that he keeps testing is something that he thinks works. I tend to disagree, but that's his style. But I think in terms of where both sides are right now and the signals they're giving publicly, I read that more of as posturing than anything else. And again, the blockade itself, for example, is basically a red herring in the negotiation of saying, I'm going to insert another ask on your side, meaning I being America, you being Iran, and then you're going to ask for me to concede on that point, but that point did not exist the last round, right? So now I've made a concession by creating something new, and now the talks can go on where you have to give me some concessions too. So I see this playing out in terms of posturing. The other part of the posturing game that both sides are playing is playing to their own domestic galleries, where there are hawks who say that you can get the job done in DC. There are many people who claim that continuous pressure on Tehran will lead to the decimation of the regime. I think that's a flawed approach, but Donald Trump has to play to those. And in the IRGC as well, there are many who think that America is near defeat. And if you don't take a deal right now and continue to ratchet up the pain, then the Arabs and the rest of the global economy will go in a meltdown, and then America will have to retreat from here with a big loss, right? I think they're both wrong, but both sides have to play to the hawks in either camp as well.
Which actually makes sense, because there are hawks on both sides, and they obviously they tend to opt for a conflict which continues to rage on till they win, but that's not going to happen. The bigger question for us here, then, and perhaps you can help us understand, is that when President Trump says that if the deal is not done, he will go back and he will destroy all power plants, etc., essentially saying that he's going to escalate and the war will get more intense and more destructive. But is that actually an option at all? Is there an appetite in the US for such an action, for renewed hostilities? Is there an appetite for something bigger, larger, ground offensive, something which can lead to a bigger catastrophe? And when I say appetite in the US, of course, when we look at the US media, it depends on what you're reading, and you get a sense of, okay, they're against this and people who are for this. But is it possible, or is it probable, that a majority of Americans are reading the situation correctly and they know that escalation and restarting the war is not really an option?
Well, so I think if you look at polling data coming out of over the last month or so coming out of America, there are a couple of things that are very clear. One, this is a war that is not popular, including within parts of the Republican Party. There has been a clear divide and a split within the MAGA base, even in terms of this war. And the anecdotal evidence I picked up on, in addition to the polling data, was you had the CPAC conference here a couple of weeks ago or so. And basically, people who attended that I spoke to said you couldn't find anybody under 30 who would call themselves a conservative, because this was a conservative conference, who was for this war. So the divide is real and the constraints are real within the party. That's one. The second one is that there's a real economic cost of this war that is being borne by consumers in a way that is hurting the president, because his whole campaign was on the idea of affordability and improving living standards for the people of America. So he's constrained by that, because if he escalates, then he knows the price of gasoline in particular will continue to go up, which bounds him in terms of a more rational path forward. The other thing to keep in mind in terms of if he chooses to escalate, then he's going towards a route that essentially means putting boots on the ground.
Yeah.
And there is basically no situation in which he can pull that off politically, given the divide in America about boots on the ground, with the midterms also coming up. So I think he's constrained by that. And he knows that, whatever has to happen now has to happen at the negotiation table. He can continue to squeeze Iran through a blockade and inflict real pain on the Iranian economy. But at the end of the day, a dramatic escalation is one that he's unlikely to pursue, in my opinion, at this point in time.
And of course, much of it is linked to, as you said, the unpopularity of the war and the fact that it is hurting him politically, and midterm elections are coming. Now, that is a factor, but is this also a factor that this is President Trump's last term? He is not going to be up for election. Yes, of course, his party, Republican Party, may suffer at the midterm polls, but perhaps for a president who's on his way out in 2 years or so, 2.5 years or so, that may not be as big a factor as perhaps is believed, that if he escalates, he can get a big win. You think that could be something that could be fueling him?
I think that's a fair point, but I think the other side actually would fuel him more, which is he's always wanted to have this big, beautiful deal with the Chinese, with the Iranians, with the North Koreans, right, to cement his legacy. So if you were to sort of say, what would I bet on Polymarket on? I would bet on the fact that Donald Trump deal moves forward, will actually to sign the deal himself. Because that's the part of his legacy that he wants to secure, and sort of show that he got a better deal, and a much better deal than the JCPOA that the Obama administration had, right? So I think when you think about Donald Trump and how he thinks about or talks about his own legacy, I would rather say that he would want to make a big deal first with the Iranians, then coming up with the Chinese, so that he's seen as this president who unlock certain things of value that are much more sustainable than another long drawn out war in Iran.
I have two more questions for you quickly. One, of course, as a Pakistani, what has happened in the last couple of weeks, our role, where things are, all as I've been saying, all roads are leading to Islamabad. Everything is happening here. We seem to be the center of world's attention. How is that impacted people that Pakistanis? Is there a visible shift in the way that Pakistan's perception has changed in the US and in the Washington Beltway, if I were to be a bit more specific?
So look, part of the Beltway remains deeply skeptical of Pakistan, and there's a long history in terms of why that skepticism persists, right? So that's obviously there. What has been, where there has been a shift has been in terms of the recognition that Pakistan still possesses significant diplomatic and kinetic heft, which not only has allowed it to play a mediating role, but also that kinetic heft and the strategic defense agreement with Saudi Arabia has acted as a deterrent. So when you talk to people who sort of look at what comes after this conflict in the region, they recognize that Pakistan basically has anchored itself as a net security provider in the GCC and the Persian Arabian Gulf region, right? And I think that's a big win for Pakistan because it anchors its own governance and security into the Middle East in ways that perhaps 2 years ago we would have never thought of, right? So I think there has been a shift. The other shift that's happened, Fahd, and again, you followed this over the years, is about the role of the diaspora, which has been deeply divided over the last couple of years. And so you are seeing this shift happening as well in the diaspora, where people are sort of saying, hang on a minute, perhaps there is a different way in which Pakistan can position itself in the world and play a positive role. And they're recognizing that this current government in Pakistan is playing that role in a much more responsible way and actually unlocking things of value for Pakistan and Pakistanis that have far-reaching consequences for the diaspora itself.
That's such an important point. Absolutely. And finally, you're very positive. You're sounding optimistic. That's wonderful to hear. So are we. We're all hoping that things actually work out. And if they do work out, then should we be ready to receive President Donald J. Trump in Islamabad?
I would not rule that out, right? I think it's maybe after this round is being too optimistic. But I think if there is an agreement made and a deal at hand that unlocks something major in the region in terms of the US and Iran and their relationship moving forward, I would bet good money on the fact that if that deal is happening, then Donald Trump will be in Islamabad.
Uzair Yunus, so wonderful to have you and to hear your analysis. Thank you so much, and I hope that you will be joining us again. Thank you.
Thank you.